Ted received his BA in economics from Notre Dame in 2002, worked briefly at ESPN and in regional sports radio in Indiana before returning to his alma mater. Away from the university, he is a published author and is currently working on what he hopes will be his first novel. So please join me in welcoming Ted Fox.
Thank you for that introduction, Peter. I actually didn't know I was going to get to do the honors for Rachel, so I'm going to do my very best right now. Thank all of you for coming out. This is, of course, an event for the ND Energy Research Symposium. We're also recording it as a live show of my podcast with a side of knowledge. I typically take folks out to brunch, but we're doing something a little different today. I'm really excited to be able to talk to Rachel, and I know you all will be excited to hear from her. It's a fitting day to talk to her. She was just named today one of the most 100 influential people in the world in terms of climate policy by a group called Apolitical. She is the CEO of Sustainable Energy for All, which we'll talk a lot about today. She's the co-chair of UN Energy. I know she's a professor at Tufts University, and I'm very excited to have her as my guest today. So ladies and gentlemen, Rachel Kyte.
Thank you.
So,
cookies.
I know, it's nice, isn't it? 100 most influential people in the world in climate policy.
With the Pope. I think he was higher up than me.
And we also talked yesterday that you do listen to podcasts, so I imagine doing this has to rank really high on the list of personal thrills for you in your life.
Yeah,
talking on this podcast.
One less on the bucket list.
I might have to ask you for a podcast recommendation before we're done.
Okay.
So I wanted to start out talking about the UN Sustainable Development Goals kind of broadly, and Sustainable Development Goal 7 specifically, because I know SE for All kind of takes its mission from Goal 7 specifically. So I'm wondering if you could kind of put those two things, the goals broadly and Goal 7 specifically, into context for us.
Yeah, no, so thank you. So it's good to be here. So if you sort of wind the clock back a little bit to around 2010, there was a discussion about the fact that the Millennium Development Goals were going to run out in 2015, and what were we going to do? That sort of conversation was sort of going on. At the same time, Ban Ki-moon had been elected the Secretary General of the United Nations, and he had grown up in Korea as a young man without any electricity, and had studied sort of by candlelight, and he couldn't quite understand why in the UN system energy wasn't really prominent and why it wasn't regarded as a development issue. And so he asked a number of very prominent businessmen and a number of prominent people within the UN system and within international organizations to form a group and to look at, well, what is the energy agenda from a development perspective? So, of course, energy gets talked about in terms of nuclear proliferation, etc., within the UN system, and then, of course, within climate, energy is a big driver of climate impacts, but it hadn't really been talked about as an energy issue. And so in 2011, this group came back and reported out and said, look, there are three big issues. Everybody needs to have access to sustainable energy. We need to be a lot more efficient in the energy that we use, and we're going to have to change the energy mix, and we're going to have a lot more renewable energy. And just around the time that this report came out, it was agreed that there would be a replacement for the Millennium Development Goals, and there would be something called Sustainable Development Goals. And then there was a big fight about, well, what would be the subjects of these goals? And there was a report that came out, and because this work had gone on, this Committee for Sustainable Energy for All, and it basically said, look, there are three energy goals, there was an ability to sort of lobby that energy had to be one of the goals, because energy was not a Millennium Development Goal from 2000 to 2015. And so these three goals basically got slightly edited and became SDG 7, the seventh of 17 goals. But when you think about it, if you don't have access to reliable or affordable or clean energy, And it's very difficult to imagine how your health clinic works effectively, how a nurse can be productive at work. It's very difficult to work out how you can actually learn if you're in a classroom that's so cold that you can't concentrate. So there's a lot of, you're gonna have a hard time getting a good yield from your crops if you don't have, better irrigation, which requires energy, etc. So Ban Ki-moon used to call SDG 7 or energy the golden thread, right? Without it, you're going to have a hard time achieving the other goals that you've set for yourself. So my mission and that of SE for All is to help all of the institutions that are involved in energy, governments, private sector, other organizations and agencies, cities, etc., to make sure that that goal is fulfilled. And when it is, we close up shop. We're not operational. We're not financing any projects. We're not crunching the numbers ourselves. We sort of chase everybody else to try to get them to be more focused on a critical path.
When you talk about those 3 objectives as part of the goal, and I know 2 of the 3 talk about doubling. You're talking about doubling the percentage of renewables in the kind of the global energy mix and doubling the rate of improvement of energy efficiency. What is I'm assuming the doubling was chosen for a very specific reason, or is that more of an aspirational target that we're going for?
No, I think in energy efficiency, doubling was pretty accurate from the analysis that were done. I mean, you forget doubling now because people have done, we're so sort of lackadaisical as an international community. A number of countries are now, they're going to have to triple, and some countries are going to have to improve by a factor of 6 to get to where we need to be. And of course, it's very frustrating because 40% of the emissions reduction that we need could be achieved through energy efficiency. And so it's one of those bizarre parts of the human condition that which makes sense and would make us better off, we don't do, right? The doubling on renewable energy was a little bit more of an art than a science. There was some diplomacy and some negotiation involved in that. And of course, what's been interesting is that every projection that's made about the pace of renewable energy's penetration into the energy mix has basically been off. The renewable energy has grown faster than people thought it would. Electric vehicles are growing faster than people thought it would. So we are underestimating the speed with which this can go. Public policy has a role in helping business go faster, but renewable energy has been a revolution. The prices have fallen. There are reasons for that. So that doubling, I'm a little bit more spurious about. The efficiency one was actually, I think, calculated.
These goals, when they're articulated, we're talking about, in terms of a time horizon, the year 2030, which, when you're dealing with something as big as climate change and humanity's response to it, 2030 is right around the corner. Mm-hmm. And yet, you're the CEO of an organization that day in, day out, week to week, month to month, you have to do very concrete things to move us towards those goals. What are the concrete things that you do on a day-to-day basis, on a week-to-week basis with global leaders in terms of trying to advance us towards those priorities? What does that work look like?
So I think first of all, we're not going to get there without leadership. And so one of the most important things is persuading leaders that it actually can be done. I mean, you're sitting in an office, you're a minister, you're a chief civil servant, you're the chief technical advisor to the ministry or whatever, and you've got lots of competing priorities. You don't have enough resources. You probably don't have enough management bandwidth to cope with all of that. And you've got vested interests, you've got political interests, you've got pressures. If you can't imagine what it looks like, it's difficult to imagine that you can build it. And it's very difficult to imagine you can build it in a short period of time. And so there are leaders around the world that have and whether at the city council level or at national level or international level, that have the bravery and the determination to sort of make a play for it. But that's not everybody. So a lot of the time we spend saying, well, look over here and look how well this has gone. And look how your neighbor or this other country has been able to go from A to B in just 10 years. And look at what they did. And so there's a huge power in that comparison. People want to know what works. They want to know what doesn't work. And they also don't want to be left behind, and they don't want to be embarrassed, and they don't want to be shamed. And so we spend a lot of our time trying to work out what is it that's working, and what are the ingredients in that which are replicable. We want to talk about what's failing, because there's an awful lot of truth and that can be learned from that, and there's a lot of money that can be saved before somebody else throws another big piece of spaghetti up against the wall. And so I think, being an agency that has a foot in the UN but has a foot outside, we have broad shoulders. And because I'm appointed by the Secretary General as well, I can take a few hits. So we can say things and ask questions that perhaps others find it difficult to ask. So for example, we track all of the finance that flows into closing the energy access gap. And despite all of the pledges and despite everybody's best intentions, we've been able to determine that only 1% of all of the financial flow for energy access is actually going to off-grid energy in the countries where the energy access gap is the largest. So if we know that distributed energy is one important part of the solution for energy access for rural people in the Sahel or in some countries in East Africa, yet only 1% of the financing, whether it's coming from international aid or from international foreign direct investment or from national savings or from national government budgets, if only 1% is going in, then we're not being coherent. And so standing up in front of a bunch of donors and saying, you're extremely generous and thank you very much, but only 1%, can we talk about this? Or standing up in front of a Minister of Finance and saying, in a country which has 70% of its population not connected to energy, to only be spending 2% of your GDP on energy, what's the conversation that would be helpful to move this forward? I mean, I think that's our role.
And it sounds like there is, again, so many of the things I feel like we all hear now are discouraging in the news in particular, and just even what you were saying earlier about, in some ways, that we're exceeding our expectations in terms of the deployment of renewables into the energy mix, that I would imagine that it's the kind of thing that when you're talking to someone in a leadership position and you're making that case of, no, this is a possible thing. This isn't maybe an idealistic thing, but it's an achievable thing. I would imagine that sort of thing helps make the case.
And they have to see it.
Right.
They have to see it. So if you take them to the desert of Morocco and you take them to Ouarzazate and you take them to the concentrated solar power there that has transformed the Moroccan economy and which will be able to export power to Europe if Europe could organize itself so that it could come up with a European-wide offtake agreement. They will dispatch power across North Africa. We could replicate that in the Sahel and have that dispatch power across Western Africa. And it's been done in 10 years. And there are billions and billions of dollars of investment made possible by a concessional financing at the very beginning of only $750 million. And it sounds like a lot, but $750 million for the kinds of power that's being generated now by these three huge concentrated solar power installations. This is transformative. And when you go and you see it, and you see that they could do it in 10 years, and you could do it in a place like Morocco, then people are amazed. You fly over the North Sea and look at the grandeur, frankly, of the wind power, and look at the new turbines that are coming in, which are, frankly, majestic. And, somebody's going to tell you, when I was a kid, I used to look out and there weren't any windmills. But that is the cheapest dispatch power into the UK grid. Right?
I was going to say, I've never completely understood the hatred of the wind turbine.
No.
I guess I don't live by one, but people really, I don't think they look that bad. I think they're kind of cool.
No, I think in the early days there was a humming and there was a noise issue, and then they had to work out how to make sure that the birds flew around them and not through them. In the early installations, this was a problem, but But now, I mean, given the alternative, it's extraordinary. So I think people, and if you go into a clinic and, and it's functioning at night, and, you talk to a nurse who is from where the clinic is, but, couldn't have imagined that she'd have a job in her hometown unless that clinic had got power, reliable power. And you know that because there's reliable power, the health outcomes, the stories of people's lives will be changed. And you see that happened because somebody could bring solar into the village. Mm-hmm. Or you see a small guy running a little kiosk in northern Rwanda, and, he can switch his electricity on and off, he can do it on his phone, he can buy just as much as he needs. The take in his shop increases by threefold because he's able to open longer hours and because he can keep milk cool in a refrigerator. And you see that he then sends his kids to school. I mean, you see the transformative effect of this technology, which has dropped in price by 80% in just, a few years. And now with the price of storage dropping at the same pace, if 10 years ago we'd said, everybody, there should be universal access to power, people would have just laughed. But maybe it was aspirational to some people in 2015 when it was agreed, but it's achievable. It's not beyond our ken as a species that we can do this. And the good thing is that we can do it without damaging the planet. Even if everybody who doesn't have energy today got it tomorrow, and got it through traditional means, that would be less than 1% of global emissions. So I am morally affronted by the argument that, that A, we shouldn't connect these people because it's going to be a problem for climate change, or B, the cheapest way to do it is to build a bunch of coal-fired power plants around the world. A, it won't be the cheapest way to do it. B, you'll be bringing all kinds of other attendant problems, including, pulmonary illnesses from bad air and all the rest of it. But thirdly, we actually have technology that can reach these people, and we can do it cleanly.
I'm glad you brought that up about bringing the energy access in those countries, because one thing that I think will resonate with folks in the audience here, being at a place like Notre Dame, you talk about SE for All, and part of what you do is amplifying the voices of the energy poor. And that really struck me as being in line with Catholic social teaching, where we talk about a preferential option for the poor and the vulnerable. And I'm wondering when, and you alluded to this there, and I may already have an answer to my question, but when you are going into a place where just access to energy is an issue, because there's approximately 1 billion people in the world without access to energy, are there potential unintended consequences that you are having to plan for in your work in those places, or is it really a universally good thing? Because you were recounting, I think, for someone like me, which is probably different than a lot of folks here, who doesn't spend my professional life thinking about energy, you can see the ripple effect on all the things and all the opportunities and the healthcare that it opens up. So I'm wondering, when you're in those countries where access to energy isn't something that's taken for granted, are there other issues that could be a negative that you have to plan for in that transition?
No, I think the good outweighs the bad. I think that what people will ask for is not necessarily energy. They'll ask for the things which are the most important to them, but they can't get them without energy. They want their kids to be able to go to school. They want to have good quality healthcare available close by. They want to be able to, especially if they're in rural areas, increase their agricultural yield. Can't do that, if you don't have certain inputs, most of which require some form of energy. And then it would be great if you could store whatever crop you're harvesting, keep it cold, and then take it to market and maybe get higher. So the things that people want, and then of course they want to run businesses. Yeah, they want to be productive in the economy. You want to have, a lathe in the village, to sharpen everybody's instruments. You want an autoclave in the clinic. You want to be able to store vaccines. I mean, the things that people need and want need energy. And so, there's a ridiculous academic argument about, is water more important than energy, or is energy more important than water? Or should we look at food? Is it SDG 2 versus SDG 7 versus SDG 6? Really, if you think about these goals, they were the greatest act of crowdsourcing the world has ever seen. There was a committee that sort of said, we think something like these goals would be about right. And suddenly business from around the world and NGOs from around the world and every country had consultations. And, what we got was 17 goals. I mean, 17, odd number, but, 17. So it's not one or the other. And if those goals are owned, right, those are owned. Maybe not everybody knows that those goals are there for them, but they're owned. And so you have to listen to where people are and then bring the goals to them, not try and fit them into a, this is an SDG 7 issue or an SDG 6 issue. So for me, I don't think there's a downside. I think certain people use the goals for their own purposes, but energy is liberating of the potential of people to live with dignity, to progress, and to participate in the economy. And that it isn't the number one agenda for every country is a function of the fact that the people who don't have energy are often voiceless within their countries.
When you talk about participating in the economy, I know, especially in these countries, for women who haven't had maybe access to participate in the economy, with what you're doing and what you're promoting with sustainable energy is providing some opportunities that, even setting aside all the benefits of bringing energy there, that are economic opportunities that they just haven't had before.
Yeah, I remember being in the northern suburbs of Nairobi, talking to a woman who was finding a way to pay for a 40-watt solar home system. And she'd started to make some things in the house because she'd got power so she could work at night. And so the next thing was that she wanted to buy a refrigerator, and then she was going to start making sort of pulp from from fruit, and start selling that as a base for juice and all the rest of it. So I mean, she had a whole plan, right? She had a whole plan, and that plan was realizable because she'd got her foot onto the bottom rung of the ladder of what energy could do for her. But it's not just electricity. The other big piece of the access gap is for clean fuels for cooking. So we estimate that there's just under 1 billion people who don't have access to electricity. There's about 2.8 billion people who don't have access to clean fuels for cooking. So, I mean, think about that, right? There's 7.5 billion people in the world. So between 30 and 40% of them can't cook a meal with clean fuels. So the choice is, here's dinner, and we've compromised your health through the indoor air pollution. And now we know more and more about exactly how compromising of your health breathing in that kind of particulate matter is. This is not a choice that and it's mainly women, should have to make. And that has really been a silent issue. Why? Because, well, if we're in a part of the world where a woman has to go for 4 to 5 hours every day to collect firewood or animal dung or other forms of mass to burn, then those 4 or 5 hours are just discounted in the economic rationale. I mean, that's not 5 hours that's missing in the ledger. It's just what they do. We don't think about what they could do if they didn't have to spend 5 hours looking for that. And then if you're in a country, if you're in a sort of peri-urban area where you have to go and buy diesel and you're using 30% of your income to buy fuel for cooking, again, the actual sort of economics of what it means to be living on a low income is not fully realized within the economy. So it's extraordinary for me, because if any of us had to spend 30% of our income just being able to, put on the microwave and cook, I think we'd be demonstrating outside fairly soon. So this is also a problem which, because it's predominantly women, hasn't shot to the top of the political agenda, with one or two exceptions. Enrique Peña Nieto made a decision that he was going to solve the clean cooking problem for the 30,000 households who didn't have it, and he more or less did. And of course, Prime Minister Modi, when he came into office, made pledges around everybody should have a toilet, everybody should be able to have access to electricity, and he has done a lot as well to at least attempt to begin to roll back the access to clean fuels issue as well.
This is the second year in a row that I've had the opportunity to talk to the keynote speaker at the ND Energy Symposium. Last year, it was Sally Benson from the Precourt Institute for Energy at Stanford. Our audience was just our server at the Morrison, and wondering what the weird guy with the microphone was doing at her table, I'm sure. So a few more people watching us tonight. But one thing that really struck me and stuck with me about that conversation was this idea, and I think, again, probably kind of a straw man argument that gets put out there sometimes, is, well, you're saying that, and I'm saying people advocating for sustainable energy broadly, you're saying there's no place for anything that's not renewable energy in our energy mix. And one thing I talked with Sally about was anyone who's willing to help tackle this problem, whatever form that may be, we're all on the same side. And looking at the SE for All site, I noticed in talking about those objectives for 2030, it was the percentage of renewables in the global energy mix from 18.3% to 36%. And I'm wondering, what is your message there on something like that? Renewable energy, I think we all see the value of it and the potential of it, and it powers us without all these harmful things that come along with it. But I do think at times people try to dismiss the sustainable energy movement as, oh, you're saying fossil fuels are gone tomorrow, kind of thing.
Yeah, so first of all, there's no scenarios whereby fossil fuels are gone tomorrow. Fossil fuels are the vast majority of the energy mix today, and the question is how quickly can we wean ourselves off them? That they will still be there after quite some time to some extent. It depends on whether or not we can capture and use the carbon from them. And technologically, we can. The question will be whether it's economically feasible and whether that's the way we want to go, or whether or not we want to do other things. But I think the starting point has to be what the science says about what our carbon pollution habit has brought upon this world, what it means for us today, and what it will mean for us for the next 10 to 20, or 30, 40 years, for the rest of the century. And that might not be so important for most of the leaders in power today, but it's extremely important for everybody in this room studying here, because your lives and your opportunities are already shaped by what we have pumped into the atmosphere over the last 30, 40, 50 years, and will continue to be shaped by what we do from this day onward. And your children's lives are going to be vastly different from perhaps what you would hope for them, and certainly what you would probably imagine for them. And so, I can sit here and argue with you about how quickly we can move from a fossil fuel-based economy to a decarbonized economy. I can tell you that I don't think it means that we have to sacrifice. I think it means that we can use those technologies in ways that are job-rich and allow us to live cleanly, and allow us to have better health, better outcomes, smarter cities, cleaner cities, et cetera, et cetera. But it isn't really about that. It's about, I think now, listening to the science and deciding that we have to, harness the technologies that we have thankfully already developed, deploy them at scale, shift the balance of our priorities within our spending, within each economy, and embrace the possibility and make a bet on ourselves, and certainly make a bet on our children. So, the perfect cannot be the enemy of the good. We need to have a cleaner energy system or systems. We need it as soon as is possible. Why? Because science is saying that if we don't, we have got very bad things in store for us. I mean, we're sitting here, it's March the 19th, is it today?
20th.
20th, there you go, time flies. And the Southern Hemisphere has just experienced the worst cyclone that it's ever experienced. A cyclone whose severity is linked to what is going on in the oceans, which is directly linked to the pollution that we've put in the atmosphere. And we just devastated the main port for the southeastern part of Africa. It's as if we just took Norfolk, Virginia, and flattened it. We just put 500,000 people's lives on hold. And we've devastated an area which produces a lot of the food for Mozambique and other parts of that world. And we did it because of the way we lived. So we have to change the way we live now. And we have the money, we have the technology. We can do this quickly or not so quickly. Chile's doing quickly. Argentina's going quickly. Morocco's going quickly. The UK has gone quite quickly. Germany went quite quickly. It's got a bit of a blip. Denmark went quite quickly. California's gone quicker than others. But look at Indiana. Look at Ohio. Look at the investment in the R&D. Look in the embrace of renewable energy. I mean, this is doable. Who are we? That's the question. Not, is it sustainable or not sustainable? No, it's who are we? That is now the question.
I think that's a question in a lot of ways. A lot of us here have been asking ourselves for a few years now, and I'm wondering, I recognize that this could be a politically charged question, so I want to ask
Go
it.
for it. Right.
In the most apolitical way that I can.
Bracing myself.
The UN and SC for All are obviously, they're international organizations.
Yep.
The United States is a major player on the international stage, and we have a current administration that does not view combating, fighting, adapting to climate change as a national or international priority. And
Right.
I'm wondering, you started at SC for All in 2015. How, if at all, has that changed your work and changed the challenge ahead of you in what you're doing?
So I think we have to be very precise. So the current federal administration has indicated that it will withdraw from the Paris Agreement and is in the process of so doing, but cannot exit the agreement until 2020. Right? The Pentagon considers climate change to be the greatest risk and threat to the exertion of US power globally. NATO considers climate change to be the greatest threat to the ability to operate military supply chains across the theaters that it must cover. California considers climate change to be the greatest threat to its economic productivity and the health of its children. I could go on, right? And it's not just blue states. It's North Carolina and South Carolina. It's Georgia. It's Texas. You look at the amount of investment into a clean energy future, and I'm looking at what Americans are actually doing, what our military is saying it is concerned about. I'm looking at what the insurance industry is saying about what coastal zone building and planning should look like. I'm looking at the pictures from Nebraska. I'm looking at what the farmers are now saying they need in order to be able to continue to maintain yields. So it seems to me, and then if you look at the number of mayors across the United States who are concerned to build green cities and who have pledged that they will continue to work together, but also work with mayors from cities around the world on deploying the technology. And if I look at American companies, I look at Johnson Controls, you look at GE, you look at all of the new startups in the new economy of renting assets rather than acquiring them, and the ability to be able to be digitally nimble within an energy economy. And I look at the extraordinary R&D that's coming out, not just from Silicon Valley, but coming out from places like Notre Dame and others all across the country. The United States of America is moving in a direction. The direction of travel is not, I think, up for negotiation. What is up for negotiation is why that's not reflected in our politics at the federal level, and at what point will it? And I think we were listening to John Kerry and Condi Rice last night here at another event at Notre Dame, and it's interesting to me that there was broad consensus between the two of them. So for me, it doesn't affect my work. I see American companies, I see American federal institutions, I see cities and states, I see academics and students from the United States of America on the ground all over the world trying to bring solutions and being part of the dialogue and making a bet on this international agreement that by 2050 we can decarbonize our economies as close as possible, and by 2030 we can realize the Sustainable Development Goals. The question for me is, why the politics of Washington, it seems so divorced from that.
If someone is sitting in here tonight or listening to this podcast in a couple weeks and listen to what you're talking, because I've seen, clearly not to the same level that you have, but that kind of energy around this, no pun intended, around this issue, and they're wondering, what is the best way for me to get involved? Is it find an organization that I really believe in and volunteer with it? Is it donating money to organizations that are already doing work on the ground? What are steps that each of us can take in our own lives in support of these very broad goals that, as you said, are having very real impacts on people in our own country, all around the world?
So I live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and so we, all kinds of people within the county have pushed and pushed and pushed for sort of community solar and community wind, and everybody's clubbed together, and then that got moved, and then some very enterprising people got going with that, and now we've all bought into that, and of course people want lower energy bills, but I think people are really quite attracted to the idea of knowing where their energy comes from and knowing where it's clean. Certainly the kids come home from school and start talking about clean energy because they learned it at school. So we're involved in a community solar project. At my at our synagogue, the synagogue has become completely, is going to be passive, I think, eventually, but we've become completely carbon neutral. And that was a way to both educate all kinds of people in the community, but also bring people together. And frankly, I think that's where it starts. It starts in the community, in your town, in your city, right? And it's everything from, people want to be able to move around. They want affordable mobility. They want affordable fuel bills. They want to be healthy. They want the air quality to be good. And this is a very important artery into all of that. And I think that now, across the country, you can agitate for that. And I think you see cities and towns, making available small grants for other things. For example, where I live, you can get a grant now to prevent stormwater runoff because the weather's changed completely, right? We get these intense, monsoon-like rains, which do enormous damage. Of course, the other way, from a climate perspective, not necessarily just from an energy perspective, is that we're going to have to change the way we eat. But the kids are coming home and sort of, wanting to, or at least mine are coming home and wanting to experiment with plant-based meat alternatives. So every part of our lives, and it's an adventure. It's going to be interesting, and of course, it is job-rich. Right?
I was going to say there's so much opportunity for it. We talked a little bit earlier about the woman in the rural village who's making this, has power now and is doing this pulp to make juice, and it's kind of an entry point into the economy. But there's innovation on kind of the possibilities on kind of a massive scale, and the economic opportunity there seem really tremendous.
Yeah, I mean, so there are so for all of the renewable sources of energy, there is a whole R&D stream, there is a whole manufacturing stream, there's a whole deployment stream, there's the operations and maintenance, whatever. I mean, and then there's industries that flow off that. And so some of those jobs can be captured locally, and some of those jobs are going to come back into the local economy. That's just sort of building new renewable energy. The jobs that come from deep refurbishment of all of the buildings that we've got, the jobs that come from energy efficiency and the technologies of energy efficiency are also extraordinarily rich, right? And our local jobs. These are local jobs. These are, I mean, we worry about automation, we worry about robotics, but these are jobs that are going to have to be done with a considerable amount of human intervention. The point, I think, is that this is an energy transition, and there are going to be winners and losers. So those people who have been employed proudly in the fossil fuel economy up to now, those jobs are eventually going to disappear. And what we can see around the world is conversations beginning in those, brown parts of the economy. So in Alberta, in Canada, in Poland, parts of Indonesia, India, etc., conversations between communities and government and the private sector and the unions about what do we want our community to look like when the coal mines are closed, or when this very old steel mill is closed, or whatever. And those conversations are difficult, but they should start now. Because it takes time to build that trust, and then you can envisage. And then, of course, we will have to bring resources to the table to support those communities in transition. We work very closely with a company called Enel, which is an Italian utility, one of the biggest utilities in the world, and has operations all over the world, including here in the United States. They have a vice president for the transition, an extraordinary woman. And in Italy, as they have closed all of their coal-fired plants and some of their other heavily carbon-intensive operations, they have sat down with the communities where they can. They've installed renewable energy in its place and retrained workers to work on that. Where they haven't been able to do that, they have been then working with the community about what the alternatives are. So they actually have a vice president, one of their senior leadership team, dedicated to that transition, and that they believe is their sort of private responsibility as one of the significant utilities in Italy. So, in the United States, we're having this sort of, ping pong conversation about, job losses and the fact that the Paris Agreement was somehow going to, undermine the U.S. economy, which is not proven and is false. But I think that what would be the greatest benefit to the around 50,000 people who are employed in mining coal in this country today is to start the conversation now about what they're going to need to manage this transition. To just put it off and pretend like we don't have to have this conversation, and then to have to start the conversation in 5 years' time, that's just 5 years of not being honest with them, I think. And, sometimes when you have a difficult conversation, you put it off and put it off. It's hard, but it's better to start now.
We have a few more minutes, so if anyone was going to have a question they wanted to ask, I wanted to give you a chance. I will ask you a question while I wait to see that on a little lighter note. SE for All, of course, grew out of the UN. You're the co-chair of UN Energy. I was wondering if you have a particular funny story of working at the UN that you could share with us.
Not for this audience, no. No, I think that the UN is a huge organization, hundreds of thousands of people employed in all kinds of different roles. From peacekeepers and peace builders to the wonderful humanitarian workers through to people who work on development. And, I think that most people don't realize how many things the UN does, actually. For me, it's been an extraordinary honor to have worked in multilateral development banks for, I think I worked for about 15 years for multilateral development banks, and then to go and work at the United Nations. And what strikes me about the United Nations is that that sort of pale blue flag that I think is universally known inspires extraordinary commitment. And so what strikes me is when I travel around the world, and you meet the people who are working on the ground for the UN, what they do above and beyond is extraordinary. But it's also extraordinary when you say you work for the United Nations. People are like, they open the door for you. Thank you very much. I mean, maybe not here in Indiana.
I definitely texted a lot of people and said, I'm interviewing someone tonight who works at the United Nations. It's the co-chair of UN Energy. Isn't that cool? So
yeah, no,
it works here too.
it's pretty cool. I mean, the worst thing about the working at the UN is the week of the General Assembly in Manhattan, when 196 heads of state come to town, right? Well, Manhattan is an island. It's finite. It can't expand. And you can imagine 196 motorcades going up and down the east side of Manhattan. It is gruesome. And on behalf of the United Nations, I'd like to apologize to all New Yorkers for what we do to their city for a week. It is horrendous.
So as we end, I alluded to at the beginning, do you have a podcast recommendation for me? I know you said you're on the plane, you're flying.
Yeah,
you travel a lot.
I have a thing. Are there any other Brits in the audience? One, okay. So since the end of the Second World War, since the early 1950s, there's been a show on the radio in Britain called Desert Island Discs. And it's on every Sunday. And it's legend. And the conceit is that they interview a person, somebody who's, it's not a famous person necessarily, it could be somebody who's notable for, within their field, physics or nursing or something like that. Or it might be a TV personality or an author or something. And they're interviewed, and the idea is that you are to be sent or marooned on a desert island, and you can pick 8 tracks of music. You can pick a book, and you can pick one luxury. And for 45 minutes, the interviewer interviews this person about their life. They tell you which 8 tracks of music they want. They play the 8 tracks of music, and they pick a book, and they pick a luxury. And I love it.
Desert Island Discs?
Desert Island Discs. So it's a BBC podcast. You can get it. And actually, they have the whole thing archived. So you can go back and listen to what people said in the 60s, the 50s. So Desert Island Discs, I highly recommend it.
That is an outstanding recommendation.
Thank you.
This episode of this show will be April 4th when that will come out. So Rachel Kyte, thank you so much for being on the show and for being here at Notre Dame and for talking to us tonight.
Thank you very much.